All right. Right, so talking about local churches today. And some people mean by local churches the Church of Romania, the Church of Russia, the Church of Serbia, and this is quite a common parlance. But the point I wanted to make today is one of the problems we have in somewhere like the UK or the USA. Local church is local not because of an ethnic culture or language, but for territory. And in each territory, it is appropriate that the church becomes localized to that territory. The church isn't something which is sort of a uniform idea which is from one place imposed on all places. The church is a set of traditions which set a framework for what it is to be Christian, what it is to be the church, how we should worship as Christians. But as that church, that set of frameworks, the apostolic tradition, moves from place to place, country to country, it takes on a particular flavors, it takes on the particular nuances that are in each place. And so these nuances are expressed by the way that the priest dresses, which is one reason I have a particularly English hat on my head today, much to the annoyance of my Eastern faithful. But to point out that the hat is a cut that depends on the national thing. The way the women cover their heads, the scarves that they use on their heads can vary from nation to nation. You'll see that the Russians and the Greeks each have a slightly different style of hat which they put on their head, and in the West they have their own cuts and styles of hat. So we must be careful not to confuse this cut and style with a particular denomination. We don't actually have an Orthodox Church one head style which is all for all nations because we are Orthodox. This is a prescribed head style for all Orthodox Christians in all nations. No, we don't have such a thing because the apostolic tradition doesn't prescribe any particular cut of a hat. We can have a sort of round hats, we can have brimmed hats, we can have hats. Now, we could say that in all places there is a custom for priests when they're outside the liturgy to put a hat on their head of some form, and we could say that women should cover their heads at all times, and so the style of a scarf, whether it have flowers, no flowers, whether it's folded this way or folded that way, or this slight this length, that length, that doesn't matter. That is a cultural thing which comes from each place. And this is important, that the gospel or the church isn't a regimented, prescribed thing in all details in all places. Why so? Because God, while He is our Lord and Christ is our Lord, and the apostolic tradition is from Christ Himself as teaching His commandments, which we must obey in all places, He wants us to rule with Him. And the rule with Him means that in each local area, the bishops together can prescribe certain customs or certain styles which are peculiar to each place. That is man ruling with God. So within the tradition, which is not prescribed in terrible detail, though in some things it's quite specific, there is a lot of scope for variation that the local place can reflect its local character. Now, part also of that is when we're united to Christ as individuals, God does not seek us to destroy our ego, our individuality, not like some Buddhist idea where you lose your ego to merge into the one in an absolute sense. In the Christian sense, we remain each our own individual, we own character, our own peculiarities into eternity. God preserves us. It's because of the nature of the Trinity, our union of the Trinity allows our individuality to be preserved. But it's not just our individuality. Our human identity is not just about our individual identity. It is about a family identity. It is about a village identity. It's about a regional identity. It's about a culture, ethnic identity. It is an identity that has multiple layers. And in the past, in modern days, we have forgotten this. We all dress the same way all over the world, and we think we've got variety, but we've just got a lot of individual variety. But what we've lost is the layered variety which you get in the past. In the past, you go to different villages. The women would dress in different costumes, and the men would dress in different costumes from village to village, from country to country. And this is also part of a variety of humanity, but it's part of our collegiality, part of our community, that we're not just individuals, but we are part of families, we are part of tribes, we are part of wider groupings. And it's appropriate that we have a connection to these groupings. God is not to destroy our families, he's not to destroy the nations. He wants all nations to be united in him, but he's not to come to destroy nations. He's not to come to destroy national distinctions and differences. He wants to preserve those in unity in the tradition of the church. So this is how the gospel spread. So this is why in each place you go, you see the gospel has a slightly different flavour. Though there is a common traditions or way we dress in Westminster presbyters, for example, we have the Phalonian or the Chasubles and the Alb, and it's common for every place. But sometimes the cut is slightly different. The Russians will have a slightly higher back. In the West, they have them long at the front and cut shorter at the sides. In the East, they cut them shorter at the front. The Russians cut them shorter, the Greeks have them slightly longer. This is all okay. Now, there's a certain level where perhaps the vestment has been disfigured so much that it's no longer what the original vestment is. But generally, there's a scope for variation in the cut and from place to place. And that's fine. If you go to Russia, you wear the Russian style. If you go to Romania, you wear a Romanian style. And you go to Greece, you wear a Greek style. And then the hats that people wear, you go to Romania, you wear a Romanian style hat. You go to Greece, you wear a Greek style. If you go to Russia, you wear a Russian style. Each of these is local, and it represents the local culture. So this is a localization church, and that grounds the church into our culture, into our society. It makes that the church becomes full part of our life, but it's not there to destroy our culture and our things. So because it becomes fully part of it, our culture it becomes reflected in our culture, and the way we dress, the language we use, things like that. It becomes expressed through these things. Bring in a common aspect of it, which is true to all nations, like the priests will wear a Phalonian and stuff, which is a Roman thing actually, Roman clothing, but because of the empire and the church takes this as part of its tradition, took the Roman clothing as identity for the priesthood, and it's used by all nations. So we don't go in suit and tie to be priests nowadays. We don't sort of dress up in Hindu clothing, even if we're in India. We still wear the Roman style clothing of their senatorial classes, etc., as our priestly vestments, but we do so according to the cut and place of each place. But we still do it because this is becoming enculturated into our tradition. This is common to the priesthood. But the cut, the form, the style, the colours, the particular way we draw a cross on it, etc., this can vary from place to place. And what is important as well, and so we must be careful as Orthodox Christians to distinguish between the tradition of the church, apostolic tradition, which is it's what we see in the Gospels, which is preserved by the holy canons, which are preserved by, and you can see in things that are common to all places of the churches. We must preserve these things, but we must distinguish this from local customs and local things. So, for example, the cut of the hat. This is not part of the Orthodox tradition that we cut a hat one way or another. We must not confuse that someone is wearing a different hat, or they're no longer Orthodox and not following Orthodox practices. That is confuse a local manifestation, local style. But you can say priests should wear a hat in public as a general norm of expectation, or a cassock in some form. But the way we cut the cassock, where we use a Russian style cassock which goes like this, or a Greek style or an English style, it doesn't matter. We use that from place to place. Is it appropriate? We start but yes, we all wear a cassock because that's an appropriate clothing for a priesthood, which is in all places and all times, and we can see that across the board. So it's making sure we keep the distinction between what's local custom and what is apostolic tradition. Now, where that matters is when you come to mission. When you come to a place like the UK from Greece and Russia, we must make sure that we distinguish between the apostolic tradition and the custom of the place from which we're bringing the gospel. We mustn't confuse that. So to become Orthodox isn't to suddenly dress like a Greek and eat Greek food and do Greek things, or to dress like a Romanian, do Romanian customs and things, or to become like Russian and wear the Russian style vestments and stuff like that. This is not what is to become Orthodox. Orthodox is to come to the apostolic tradition. Now, when mission comes here, it's got to recognize you cannot. Orthodoxy is incarnated in a sense in a specific clothing and style. You can't avoid a particular cut of your vestment. There's no sort of abstraction of the cut. Every cut has a sense of a localization to it. So when mission comes to any place, it should come from one source. And naturally, it will come with a particular cut, a particular style, a particular way of doing things, which is part of the cultural expression. But initially, to become Orthodox, it's hard to pull these things apart. And so, for initially, the mission comes, it will come in that clothing. But in time, we're talking a couple of centuries and stuff, not years, we're talking centuries, this received thing should eventually become localized. And this is established by having local bishops, bishops of the land, bishops who are locals made in place, who form a local synod of that territory. No longer ruled by bishops from overseas, but bishops who grew up in this land. And they, having been grounded in the faith, stably in the faith over, this is why it takes sometimes centuries, should be given authority and freedom to localize their own style of clothing, their own style of some musical styles and stuff, and maybe even slight stylistic forms of iconography. Some of these things vary from place to place, and it needs to become localized in each place, picking up on its own cultural influences, its own heritage of art, clothing, and things like this. And this is where the church truly comes embedded. So one of the things that missions need to do is come in and share the holy tradition, and they need to, as soon as practical, start bringing local bishops, local clergy, local bishops, establishing a local synod, so that in time that the church can start becoming local. It's no good for priests and bishops from overseas to come across and look after missions as a foreign extension of their own local church and their own local practice and stuff. This is denying the locality of the people in their own place. It is like a cultural imperialism. It's trying to force the people not to be English Orthodox, but to become Greeks or Russians or Serbians, etc. Because they're having to dress and behave like Serbians, Greeks or Russians or whatever their culture is. And so the church must come across in its mission, bringing the apostolic tradition where there is a problem, where it's been followed, say in a case like the UK, where there's heretical traditions, they've moved away from apostolic tradition, restore that, but to impose their cultural heritage here, to allow the British to have it. And somewhere like Britain is interesting. It has already received a Christian culture, a Christianized culture from centuries before, which it received, and it has its own customs, etc. And where those customs and cultural things are all good, there's nothing wrong with them, and the way they cut the vestments, they put on a silly, funny-looking hats or something like this. We don't throw these out as long as the priest is following the apostolic tradition, and it's good to revive them because this is already part of the culture of a place there. And so, and even the liturgical rites which a father has brought and enculturated here, these should be maintained and revived again, but making sure that they're done in the harmony of the Orthodox way of faith. And some of the difficulties is sometimes there's some certain habits that come from the heretical ideas, etc., which need to be pruned out of these things. So this needs to be done with care. But there is a culture here. Now, you don't necessarily have to do it that way. You can bring the Eastern Church way and start establishing that, but again, it should be expressed in its own local language and allow a certain flexibility of its own British style. So when you come to Britain Orthodox Church, okay, I'm coming to the British Orthodox Church, I'm coming to the Scottish Orthodox Church, I'm coming to the Irish Orthodox Church, in its own way. It's just like we have the Romanian style and the Bulgarian style, the Serbian style and the Greek style. Each has its own flavour. One of the important parts of the church too is local saints. We are re-establishing the canon, the calendar of saints that, for example, the Russian missions come here. The Russian state saints, as Russian saints, start taking less priority in the festival calendar, and the British saints take a higher priority. We celebrate the local saints. Just like in Russia, your Russian saints take a higher priority than Greek saints. Now we have common saints like today, St. Peter and Paul, which are all churches. Now, of course, we all venerate that at the same level because these are universal saints, the ancient saints. But other than that, we start to change the priority of services so that the local saints have higher priority, Russian saints and stuff, sometimes or even drop off because they're not relevant to this local place. They are saints that are proper to their own territory. And the localization is territory-based. It's not ethnic-based. The church does not, in each place, the territory, all peoples of all nations come to the one church. We are all one in Christ. We're one body. And this is why we have people from all different cultures coming into the same local church. And if you move to a different local place from your cultural heritage, you accept the customs and the things of the place where you go. Because that is a proper thing. If I go to Romania, I accept the customs of Romanians. I don't start developing an English-style church in Romania. As long as the Romanians are Orthodox, I go to their churches because all nations come together in one place. And so it is by territory. So it's very dangerous for churches to think that they are looking after an ethnic group or things. Now, having said that, there are immigrants, there are refugees, etc. from various nations, and local bishops have to sometimes give some space for these groups to have something in their own style, their own language, because they are difficult to integrate into the local language. So this is economy, this is the care for people. But there must be a local church there, because these people, over a couple of generations, will just absorb into the local culture. And if they don't have a local church, they will reject their churches coming, there's Greek churches, Cypriot churches, Russian church, because it's a cultural identity of a foreign culture. It is not their local culture. And now push it aside as a foreign thing that is no longer local. And of course, people converting, they don't want to convert to become a Russians or Greeks or something. They want to be British. They want to be Irish in this country, or in the US or New Zealand, whatever. In Africa, you want to be an African. You don't want to turn into little Greek or little Russian. You want to remain as African. And so the church needs to be localized for this, and it doesn't want to have these. And unfortunately, what's happened in Orthodoxy, quite uncanonically, all these groups from Serbia, Russia, have turned up into places in the UK where they have no canonical right to be there. Serbian church has the territory of Serbia. It has no right to be anywhere outside Serbia. Nor does the church in Romania have any right to be looking after any churches, any people outside Romania. Nor does the Russians have any right to be looking after churches outside Russia. Now, there is an exception to this when the mission is contiguous to the land. So Russia pushes towards pagan lands to its borders, like across Siberia into northern China, into Japan, into Alaska. This is appropriate because it's extending the church contiguous to its border, and there's no jurisdiction there. But we've got to be careful though. When Russia pushes south, they have the trouble. They try to take Georgia underneath themselves for centuries. They subjected, and then they recently said, "Oh, Georgia's now free." Well, Georgia was actually a mission church of Antioch, which is the right patriarch for the East. All Iran, India, that's all belongs to the patriarch in Antioch. There's no right for Russia or Constantinople to be working in these places. This is the territory of Antioch. And so Russian church, even though it's contiguous, sometimes needs to stop and say, whoa, this is now moving into a territory. And that the Antiochians had given Georgia autocephalous free status to rule itself without having to, which means that their Catholicos, their head, doesn't have to be approved or ordained by the Patriarch of Antioch. This is what it means. They're still in communion. They're not separate. This has already been decided by Antioch. And they had this, and so this later Russians taking over that was a massive sin. They had no right to be subjugating another territory outside this jurisdiction. So, but this is problem of power, of empires and stuff. Sometimes they start snatching things beyond themselves. But we must remember, we have a limit to our territory, and we need to stop. Sometimes, like in the Balkans, for example, there's missions from the west and from Constantinople, from Rome and Constantinople, both from the same place. In this case, you allow the people to decide. We want you to have you for our patriarch or you for our patriarch. Sometimes it even has justification to be there, so the people can decide, as they did. They said we would choose Constantinople for our patriarch, and so be it. Constantinople becomes appropriate. Now, having said that, the sees of Rome, or New Rome, Constantinople, have a slightly wider jurisdiction. They're not fixed to their localities in the same way as the other one. This allows them to help coordinate missions beyond the territories of other churches. So everyone else is stuck to their territory, but for going, and it's contiguous. But for things beyond these, the fathers directed Constantinople or Rome sort of took overall management. So you see the Rome, the Pope of Rome, Gregory, looking after remissionizing Britain again, or Scandinavia. It would be controlled from the center there, which is important because it means that the mission becomes more about apostolic tradition, the common tradition in all places, than, oh, this is a Serbian style of orthodoxy which you're bringing to all places, etc. Or this is a Irish style of Christianity which you're bringing, which happens. We can't avoid that. But if it comes from the central sees, it means there's a more commonality to it. And you'll see in the history of a church that the central sees of Constantinople and Rome set almost liturgical standards as well. So you'll see in the East, all the churches, even Antioch and Alexandria, which are our own patriarchs of high honor, eventually started to copy the liturgical traditions of Constantinople. Even if Constantinople itself had developed its liturgical traditions, drawing on the things that happened in Jerusalem and etc., eventually these other sees, but they did that freely. Constantinople did not impose itself on these churches. It just said, this is the way we do it, and these other ones started to copy. It helped when the Muslims came across, and the patriarchs Antioch and Alexandria ended up in Constantinople. They probably picked up these ways and brought it back. Was part of the influence of it. But nevertheless, having studied the history of Jerusalem, they basically freely accepted the way of Constantinople and replaced it. That's fine. If the churches freely copy one of the sees, and in the West, you get all the churches in the West basically follow Rome. So the canon of a church uses a Roman canon, but each has a local flavor. What happens in about the 16th century of Trent, Rome decided to impose its one form. They said everyone in all the churches must serve in this liturgical practice exactly like this and use their hands exactly like this and do exactly the same. This was an imposition on all the churches. This is not a true localization. This is an imposition of a particular style. That wasn't what happened before. The other churches looked to Rome as a guide, but each style was localized in its own region. Each had its own saints, each had its own style of doing the liturgy, its own little quirks, its own little hymns that uses here and there, which is perfectly appropriate. So, it's important to localize the church. It's important to recognize in places like the UK and France, Western Europe, even though they fall into heresy, they still had a Christian culture beforehand. The fathers had brought the church, and this should be recognized and either revived or respected at a certain level. But not absolutely. There's a case to be made that they fell into heresy. You follow the way, the general pattern of the ways of East now. But it's important that the missions should relocalize the churches, seek to put local bishops in, people who are established in the Orthodox faith, but are local, who have an interest in the local life of the church, interest in local customs. For people coming from overseas, they're interested in their own local customs. They have no emotional mindset, instinct to think about the customs, the way of speaking, the way of little ways of prayers and stuff, the use of language, the way of dressing and stuff that is appropriate to a local place. They just think in their own cultural framework. And it's very hard to get out of that. But you need to be able to bring a leadership who has that connection. And also that leadership has more interest in connecting, because the church can speak to the government, etc., in an official capacity. They have to have people who are interested, understand the local culture of a way to speak to the government, to give a voice for the church, to have an interest in the land, what's going on, to speak to the government, to criticize them. What are you doing with this law and that law? Again, if bishops are not themselves local here, they have no connection, they have no feeling, they have no sense of this. They may learn that a little bit, but it's not the same as someone who's grown up in that culture. And this is another important part. And very important too in the mission is that there should be one church that is doing the mission in a place, so we don't get confusion of cultures coming in. And this is unfortunately what happens in the UK and the US. You get Russians and Serbians and Bulgarians and everybody, Romanians, each has their own culture. This is very bad, because it makes local people think that the Orthodox Church is different. There's different Orthodox churches. Or it makes people say, I prefer this cultural way of doing it to this culture, and you start getting division amongst the local population. You start getting people converting to Orthodoxy for the sake of its culture, not for the apostolic doctrine. Oh, I like Russian choirs, I'm going to come to the Russian aesthetic. Oh, I like the Romanian way of doing this. Whoa. We're not converting to Orthodoxy for its aesthetic, its cultural things. We're coming to the faith of the apostolic tradition. This is another problem. And one of the worst problems is that if the bishop's coming to look in these forms, then there is no reason to localize the culture. You become Orthodox, you become a Russian Orthodox, you become a Romanian Orthodox, and no one has an incentive to become the local. Which one should have priority? Which one should become this? Where are the bishops all together as one, speaking as one church in this land? No, we've got different churches from bishops from all over the place, and there's no accountability between them. And so we get canonical chaos going on. The priest moves from here to here, doesn't like this. There's no commonality of this priest is the frock, this priest is, no, I'll take you, it's chaos. And as I said, it doesn't give room for proper localization of the church. And that means the local people are always having to be foreigners in their own land, in their own church, because they can't divorce their orthodoxy from their cultural things. So the Russians say, we're not the Greeks, we're not the Greeks because we have the Russian thing, we're not the Romanians. This is not helpful for the mission. So hopefully the bishops will one day sort themselves out and remove this sort of localization of foreign localization from the UK and allow it to develop its own. Yes, it may draw on one source or another as its formal base, but we've got to remember we are not in Russia or Greece, etc., and we shouldn't be trying to think, oh, I want to have a Russian style, or I want to have a Greek style, or whatever. Whichever the principal one, we follow their style. If their style is not according to the traditions of the church for some reason or another, okay, we can repent from it, move away from it to our own local thing. Well, we just accept that this is a way it's done in this place. But we must be very careful not to have this fusion of styles and stuff, which is dividing the faith, dividing the churches, and making converts just think that the Orthodox Church is simply an ethnic thing. And this is what's happening. If you don't divide this out, it becomes simply a cultural expression. That's what I do as a Greek on Sunday. This is a Greek church. This is the way we do things as Greek. Now, you've got your own religion and the Anglicans and stuff there. It's not about orthodoxy. It's not about the tradition of the church. It's just about, this is our cultural style against your cultural style. And when children of those, if that's what the church becomes, the children, when they grow up here, they're no longer part of that culture. They no longer go to church. They're not interested in the faith and seeing it as a faith. They just see it, that's their parents' culture, their grandparents' culture. That's not our culture. We'll go to an English churches and things like that. So that is a problem because it just collapses into there. So anyway, that is my little rant on the localization of churches. And have any questions from amongst my very variety congregation? We're all happy. All right. Until next week, God bless you and have a great week ahead.